In this lesson, we're going to be looking at using the speed reading technique of scanning in order to locate and retrieve specific information within texts. The aim of this lesson is to ensure that you know how to identify when an exam question requires scanning and information retrieval. Now, the exam questions used in this lesson are from Edexcel's new 9:1 GCSE English language specification, but the skill of scanning and information retrieval and the types of questions are common across all of the new 9:1 GCSE specifications, so this skill actually applies whatever exam board you're doing. We're also going to make sure that you understand how to scan and retrieve information effectively, so we're going to go over the skill of scanning and show you how to use that to retrieve information quickly, and that will mean that you'll be able to scan whatever text you're going to need to deal with and be able to retrieve information relevant to the exam questions that you are being asked. So how can we tell if questions require scanning and information retrieval? Well, the first thing is that a lot of the questions that require speed reading, scanning and the retrieval of small chunks of information direct you to narrow line references within the longer text that you're dealing with. When you read that question, you need to highlight the line reference that you're being directed to, and then when you go back to that text you only look at those line references. You need to make sure that the examples that you give come from within that given line reference. If you give examples from outside of that, you won't get the marks. Another indication that you're required to use speed reading, scanning and information retrieval skills is that you're being asked for a very specific type of information. So quite often you'll be asked to find information related to one particular aspect of what we refer to as site. So it could be setting or subject, ideas, themes or events, and it'll be one very specific element of those that you then have to go and locate some information about. And the final way you can tell if you need to use these speed reading techniques is that the marks on offer for these questions tend to be quite low. In terms of the Edexcel papers, questions 1 and 2 on both papers are going to require you to use speed reading, scanning skills and retrieve very particular pieces of information, and question 4 on paper 2 will also require that. You also need to use scanning and information retrieval skills, of course, when you're answering the higher tariff questions, so questions that require essay responses and comparative responses, because obviously you're going to need to scan for relevant quotations, and when you're comparing text you're going to need to scan for those comparative examples from the second text. So that's how we can tell if a question requires you to apply these speed reading techniques and require information retrieval skills. So let's look now at some examples from the Edexcel 9:1 exams. So here we have a typical question 1 and 2 from paper 1. Now for Edexcel, paper 1 is the 19th century prose fiction. So these first two questions relate to a piece of 19th century prose fiction, and what we can see just by glancing at these is that both of these have a very specific line reference. So let's focus on question 1. So question 1 is asking us to look at lines 1 to 5, so we are only looking at 5 lines of a much longer text. We're being asked to identify a phrase in this instance. You could be asked to identify a word, a sentence or a phrase. Now the difference between a phrase and a sentence is that a phrase doesn't tend to include a verb. A phrase will be 2 or more words that convey a complete idea, but they are not a full sentence. They are part of a sentence or part of a clause. Okay, so if you're asked for a phrase, make sure you give a phrase and not a sentence. And in this instance, the phrase we need to identify from lines 1 to 5 must show that Joe, the character in the text, needed cheering up. So let's have a look at lines 1 to 5 from this text and see what we can find in there that we might be able to use in response to this question. Right, here's the first page of the text for the 19th century questions 1 and 2 that we're looking at the moment. It's an extract from the story Little Women. Now, if you remember, question 1 has asked us to look just at lines 1 to 5 and find things that tell us, that show us that Joe needs cheering up. So we're going to zoom in now. We're going to scan through those lines and look at potential pieces of evidence that we could provide in response to that. Okay, so as we go along, you can see we've drawn out lines 1 to 5, and as we go along we are looking for anything that shows she needs cheering up. So we sort of scan our way along and then we get to revived. Okay, so this idea of reviving is interesting because it suggests that somebody is in a downcast mood. They need to be revived, they need their spirits picking up. So if we look around, it actually says the walk revived her spirits. So we could in fact use the whole thing, the walk revived her spirits there, the whole clause there. Flattering herself, we could use that. She made good bargain. Trudged, she trudged home again. So that suggests that she's in a low mood, she's feeling a bit miserable. Let's carry on to the end to line 5. Okay, is there anything there? There isn't anything in those last few lines. So we've got 3 options here. We've got the idea of reviving her spirits, so we could have revived her spirits, we could have flattering herself, or we could have trudged home. Let's go back now and look at what answers were acceptable in response to that question. Okay, so the thing that we need to be aware of with question 1 is that it's only worth 1 mark. The mark scheme is very strict in terms of what it will allow as responses to this, and you need to give a direct quotation when you are writing your response. So there are a number of possible answers each time for question 1 on paper 1. So let's have a look at the possible answers here. So from lines 1 to 5, the phrases that showed that Joe needed cheering up were: the walk revived her spirits. The reason this is correct is because the idea of being revived shows that her spirits were down, that her mood was low, and so she needed to be revived. She was flattering herself, so she's trying to convince herself that she's happy or she's a better cook than she actually is. And then finally she trudged home again, and that word trudge suggests that she's sort of walking in a downcast kind of way. Okay, so for question 1, it's always a better idea to provide a direct quotation for that one. Now, when we turn to question 2, again, we're given a very narrow line reference, lines 7 to 13. This time, we are asked to give 2 ways in which the writer shows that Joe is not a confident cook. Now, for this question, you will always be told that you can use either your own words or direct quotations. And what that means is you can either provide a short direct quotation, or you can paraphrase, but you must keep the meaning of the quotation that you are paraphrasing, and you must be very clear about what that actually means. So again, let's go back and have a look at lines 7 to 13 and see what possible examples we could give in response to this. In response to question 2, we've been asked to look again at a narrow line reference. This time we're being asked to look at lines 7 to 13. Now, you can see on the screen that actually line 7 isn't the start of a sentence, it's actually partway through a sentence, and that's quite common. So it's the line reference rather than the full sentence, and what we're looking for are any examples that we could use either as a direct quotation or that we could paraphrase to show that Joe is not a confident cook. So the way the writer's writing about Joe cooking that tells us as the reader that she's not very good at it and she's not very confident in her own abilities. So again, we're going to skim across and we're only going to stop and read when we see a key word that might be relevant. Oh, flowery, crockery, flushed. Okay, flowery, crocky, flushed and dishevelled figure. That could work. Flowering, crocky suggests she's messy. Flushed, she's red in the face, she's a bit stressed. Dishevelled, maybe her clothes are sort of not on properly, or she looks a bit of a mess, so she's in a fairly stressful situation. Let's continue. Demanding, tartly, being demanding. When people are stressed, they tend to be a bit short-tempered, so that could work as well. So when you're not as confident in something, you're quite defensive, and so if somebody offers help, you might snap at them. Let's carry on. Language cannot describe the anxieties, experience and exertions which Joe underwent that morning. Now, that's a good example. It's quite long. If that was going to be one of the examples we were going to give, that would be something that would need to be paraphrased because it's too long to provide as a direct quotation. Fearing to ask any more advice. Oh, she did her best alone. So she doesn't want to ask for any more advice, maybe because she's asked for too much already, or she feels she's asked for too much, or because she's worried that by asking for advice she is showing others that she doesn't know what she's doing. So she did her best alone. She struggles on. She doesn't want anybody else to see that she doesn't know what she's doing, and that suggests a lack of confidence. The lobster was a scarlet mystery to her. That could work, but we've got a number of examples there that we could use. Some of them would need paraphrasing, but there are some that we could quote directly, some of the shorter ones. Okay, let's go back and have a look and see what the mark scheme suggests as potential responses to that particular question. Okay, so as we've seen, there are a number of different examples that we could use, and we can either quote them or we can paraphrase them. So we might decide to say that Joe is a flowery, crocky, flushed and dishevelled figure, and there we're giving that as a direct quotation. We could give that as by paraphrasing it. So we could use that same example, but we might write, Joe gets in a mess when cooking and looks stressed about it. Okay, so we've kept the essential meaning of that original quote. So if we look, Joe is a flowery, crocky, so she's covered in flour, she's got all the crocks, all the pots and pans everywhere, so she's messy. She's flushed and dishevelled, so her face is red, she looks in a mess, so she looks like someone that's stressed. So when we've paraphrased that, we've clearly understood what that quotation means, so that would get us a mark. For our second example, we might say that she is described as fearing to ask any more advice. So again, we're giving the direct quotation. And what you'll notice about this is that we're not explaining these quotes, we're not analysing any language features in there. That's not what's required. Remember, it's only worth 2 marks, so they don't require these detailed analysis. Again, we could paraphrase this. We could write, she's already asked for lots of help and doesn't want to ask for any more. So like the first example, we've kept the essential meaning of she is described as fearing to ask any more advice. So we've kept the connotations of that quotation, but we've reworked it into our own words. So if you are going to paraphrase, make sure that you have understood fully what the quotation means and that you are paraphrasing accurately. Okay, so how do you scan and retrieve information effectively? Well, we've just been doing it. So what we've been doing is scanning. We've been running our eye over the section of text that we need to look at. So we've been zooming in on those narrow line references, and when we were doing that, the arrow that you could see on your screen was representing running the eye over the text, and then we only stopped when there were words or phrases related to the particular aspect of sight that's been specified in the question. When we stop, what we do is to look around those keywords, those clusters of words, in relation to that aspect of sight. So we stop whenever our attention is drawn by something relevant to the question we're being asked. And then what we're doing once we've stopped and we're reading around is to choose the word, the phrase, the sentence, whatever it is we've been asked for, that illustrates the particular aspect of sight in the question most clearly. The one that stands out, the one that seems the most obvious, should be the example that you quote or that you paraphrase. Obviously on paper 1 you need to provide two examples in question 2, so you're going to need to find two. To scan and retrieve information effectively, you scan, you stop, you select, you run your eyes over your alert keywords related to whatever the focus of the question is, and then you read around those keywords to select the evidence that you're going to use either directly or in the form of paraphrasing. Okay, let's turn our attentions now to paper 2 for the Edexcel 9 to 1 exams, and on your screen you can see typical questions 1 and 2. Now these are worth 2 marks each, and you can see they are slightly different from the question 1 and 2 examples from paper 1 that we just looked at for the 19th century prose paper for paper 1. So if we look at question 1 for this, again we are given a very narrow line reference, lines 5 to 13. This time we are asked to give 2 examples. Now although you are not told directly that you can use your own words, it is acceptable to paraphrase in response to this question. You can either quote directly or you can paraphrase, but the advice remains the same. If you are going to paraphrase, be very clear about what the quotation you're paraphrasing actually means. Okay, so those 2 examples that we're either going to quote or paraphrase need to show that Aaron Ralston thinks he secured his position well. Okay, as with paper 1, the mark scheme for question 1 on paper 2 is very strict. There is a set list of responses that they will accept, and anything that isn't on that list will not be accepted. And as with paper 1, you simply need to provide the quote or paraphrase it. You do not need to provide any analysis or explanation. Look at the space that's available. There just isn't space for you to do that. They are not asking for detailed analysis. They are testing your scanning skills and your ability to retrieve relevant pieces of information. So for question 1, there are a number of things we could have. We could have the word lock, and that is all we would need to put to get 1 mark for that. Or we could have the word tight, or the word hold, or finally the word support. Okay, because they all mean the same thing. There's a sense of security there. There's a sense of having achieved it. For our second example, we could have confirming, so that's his assurance. He's sure. You can tell that he's sure that he's done that. Or we could have fully, so there's a sense that he's done the best that he possibly could. Any 2 of those would have got you the 2 marks, and you can see that all we've done is to provide the quote enclosed in single quotation marks, no explanation. We haven't provided the full sentence or the phrase that those quotes appear in. You just need to provide the word, and that's perfectly acceptable. Okay, let's look now at question 2. Now for question 2, again, you're not told this, but the expectation is that you are going to provide a direct quotation, because the question is about the use of language. So you must provide a direct quotation that illustrates a particular use of language. Again, we've got a very narrow line reference, 17 to 19 here. And what they want us to do is to provide a quote which shows how the writer is using language to show how difficult it was for him as the stone falls. Not how difficult it was generally, but how difficult it was during one particular event. So when you're looking at these questions, make sure you read them very carefully and make sure you identify the particular focus of this question. Okay, so we need to go and find a quotation from lines 17 to 19. There are always more than one example that you can give. For the purposes of this lesson, we're going to use this one. Fear shoots my hands over my head. Now, we get 1 mark for that, that's fine, and you'll see because it's a direct quotation, we've enclosed it in single quotation marks. All right, that's very important. When it's just a quotation from a text, it's single quotation marks. If you're quoting dialogue, you would put double quotation marks. Now, to gain the 2nd mark, we are asked to explain how the writer uses language in the example we've given, in the quotation that's given. What a lot of people do is they provide the quote and then they write something like this. The writer uses personification. that's correct, the writer does use personification. Unfortunately, a response like that is not showing any understanding of how the writer is using personification. All it is doing is showing the examiner that you know what personification is and you know that it's been used. It isn't showing understanding, and a response like that will get no marks whatsoever. Okay, so we need to look at a better response. And a better response to this would still be fairly short because you've only got a couple of lines to write it in, but it would be something like, the writer personifies fear to show how difficult it was to move. Now again, the technique has been identified, so identified it as being personification. That's the particular language technique or device being used here. But there is an explanation of how that is being used. So it's being used to show that it was difficult to move. Okay, so the fact his hands go up over his head and he's afraid and that sort of thing. So when you're answering a question like this, either question 2 or question 5, where you're given a quotation, you're being asked to explain how the writer is using language. You need to explain the effect that the language device you have quoted has in relation to the particular focus of the question that you are answering. It is not enough just to name the device, just to identify the device. You need to write something more, something like this, in order to get the mark that is available. In terms of the questions on the Edexcel paper, we need to think about how to explain how language has been used, and this applies to paper 2 particularly, but obviously in the higher tariff questions where you're analysing and you're evaluating, you're also going to need to do this in response to those questions too. So on paper 2, questions 2 and 5 are going to ask you how to explain how language has been used. Question 2 will ask you to provide a quote to illustrate a particular use of language and then explain the effect of that use of language. Question 5 will provide a quote printed on the exam paper and ask you to explain the language device that's been used in the quote provided. Both questions are going to ask you to explain how the language has been used to show a particular aspect of sight, and as we've just seen with question 2, that is very, very particular. Do not just name the language device or devices used in the quotes. You will get no marks. Even if you name the correct device using the correct technical term, if you haven't explained the effect of that device in relation to the question, you won't get the mark. What you do need to do is to name the device if you possibly can, and then explain the effect they have in relation to the focus of the question that you are actually answering. Okay, what we have on the screen now are 2 copies of a question 5 from a paper 2 from the Edexcel 9-1 exams, and you can see that in question 5 you are given a quotation, so there is a short quotation printed on the paper, and then you are asked a question. You're told where it comes from, and then you're asked to explain how language is used to show something. Now, there will always be more than one possible language device in the quotation that you are provided with. What you're being asked to do is to identify a relevant device, a device that is relevant to the question that's been asked. In your explanation that you provide in response, you must quote that device. Although the quote is printed, the whole quote is printed on the paper for you, you have to retrieve that information, that specific quotation, and you have to show the examiner you've retrieved it by quoting it within your explanation. And your explanation needs to focus on the way that that particular language device is being used to illustrate or to show whatever aspect of sight the question is asking you about. So in this question we are being asked for an explanation of how a specific aspect of language is showing the reader that the weather conditions were difficult. So what a lot of people do is just to write by using a metaphor, like we saw in the last example. As with the last example, that will get absolutely no marks. The reason it gets no marks is because all a candidate like this has done is named a device. So they've just showed they can identify a device, but there is no demonstration of any understanding of the effect of that device within this particular quotation. And what the examiners want to know is not that you know what a metaphor is and what a metaphor does, but that you know what this particular metaphor does in relation to whatever aspect of sight you've been asked to write about. So a better response to this would be by using the metaphor cemented together to emphasise that the ice was solid and unbreakable. So here, this response would get the 1 mark on offer. So you're not going to write a lot, and remember your response must stay within the space provided. The reason it gets the mark is because it's identified the device, it's used the correct technical term, metaphor, it has then quoted, so it's retrieved that very particular piece of information, the key phrase in there, and that's embedded into the answer, and then it's explained how that is showing that the weather conditions were difficult. So that metaphor is showing that the ice was solid and unbreakable, so therefore it's difficult. So you can see the difference between a good and a bad answer, an answer that gets the mark and one that just will never get the mark at all. So how to explain how language has been used? Well, you name it. If you can, identify a specific language device using the correct term, if you possibly can. You then quote it. Retrieve that language device, retrieve that example, that word, that phrase, whatever it might be, and quote it within your response. And then explain it. Explain how that language device in that particular context of that quotation is illustrating the aspect of sight that has been referred to in the question that has been set. So to scan and retrieve information effectively, you need to do the following things. You need to read, scan, stop, read around, and then select. So what does that mean? Well, read the question very, very carefully. And as you're reading that question, highlight, underline, circle, however you do it, but identify the line reference, that narrow line reference, and the particular focus of that question. When you come to scan it, scan just the section that you've been directed to within the line references. There's no point scanning the whole text or anywhere else in the text because you can't use anything other than examples within those 2 or 3 lines that you've been asked to look at. So scanning, remember, is running your eye over the text and only stopping to when you see any words or phrases related to the particular focus of the question that you are answering, and that's why you need to identify that before you start the scanning process. Once you've stopped, once something's caught your attention, you then need to just look around that word or that phrase and see if there is anything there that you could use either as a direct quotation or that you could maybe paraphrase in response to that question. You then need to make your selection. You need to decide which examples you're going to use, because remember, for all of these questions there will always be more than one possible answer that you can give, one possible example. So choose the one that you feel illustrates the focus of the question most clearly. So to scan and retrieve information effectively, you need to read, scan, stop, read around and select. And that is the case whatever exam boards examinations you are taking.